are finding to preserve their EU connections through exploring alternative business models, including setting up sister organizations or satellites in member countries. So you'll be able to find these resources, updates and additional guidance on what the new context means for the creative and cultural and audiovisual sectors in the UK, all of that on our website. So the Creative Europe Desk UK team will continue to be able to support you to access the opportunities that still exist under the current program for the first 3 months of the new year. So it will be available until we close on the 31st of March of 2021. So until then, we'll still be continuing our work to create further capacity building opportunities for our Creative Europe UK alumni network, with the aim to strengthen this network so that it becomes its own knowledge resource beyond the end of March. Also in early 2021, we'll be publishing our new impacts report, which looks back at the program from 2014 to 2020. And it forms part of a wider legacy campaign that we'll be rolling out to celebrate the successes and highlight the stories and the case studies from Creative Europe Desk in UK. A lot of you have already actively contributed, sharing your own experiences and articulating the transformative impact that the program has had on your own practice. So obviously we want to invite you all to join us in the next 3 months as we celebrate your Creative Europe achievements through your success stories. So this is just what I wanted to highlight from you in terms of what the resources that we have available, the suite of events that we've been rolling out and that we'll continue to roll out into the next 3 months of 2021. And just to encourage you to continue to connect with us and to be in contact with us and to join us obviously in terms of the legacy campaign that we'll be rolling out, just kind of highlighting all of the work that you've been doing with us. So just a quick final word from me, just to thank our guests today for their time and their willingness to share that knowledge, which is going to be hopefully of great use to everyone participating. And hopefully we'll have a fruitful discussion following. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks so much, Isabel. Really great to give an overview of the rest of our work. And thanks to everyone who's contributed so far. I'll stop spotlighting you there. Just a quick reminder before I move on to Zelie that we are recording this meeting. So, and this is to enable people who aren't able to attend to benefit from these presentations as well. So we'll be sharing this presentation. So if there's anyone who wasn't able to make, you'll be able to share that with them too. So before we get started on the main presentations, I'd also like to invite Zelie Flach to say a few words about the Arts Infopoint UK pilot. So this event is in partnership with Arts Infopoint UK, and it was a really natural fit in terms of providing mobility information to the sector. So Zelie, are you there and are you able to say a few words?
I'm here. Okay, thank you. Yes, really pleased to be partnering with Creative Europe Desk for this webinar on incoming mobility routes. It's such an important topic at the moment for many of our UK and our international cultural sector right now. Just to introduce myself, my name's Zelie Flach, as Kate said. I work for Wales Arts International, which is the international agency of the Arts Council of Wales. And I'm just here to introduce very briefly the Arts Infopoint UK pilot project, which we're working on alongside Creative Scotland, Arts Council England, and soon to join Arts Council Northern Ireland as well. What it is part of a network of information points through On the Move, which you'll hear more from later from Marie and from Jana from the German Infopoint, as Kate's already said. But we want to set up a portal that will provide practical information on mainly incoming mobility into the UK for artists. So issues such as visa, what we're talking about today, visa routes, it could be social security, taxation, customs, things like that. As I said, it's going to be mainly incoming to the UK, but we do realise that there's a lot of need for information outgoing. So we will be signposting to other sources of information, and we will also be working in partnership with some of the other info points to provide some similar webinars in the future. So our website will be launching in January. There's a holding page at the moment. There's space for feedback. We want to know what are your needs, what is the information you're looking for, and we'll see how we can help with that. So please do go and on that, let us know what's missing, what's not out there. what you need help with. And just keep your eyes and ears open, because we'll be having some more events in the future and some resources going up very soon. Thanks, Kate.
Wonderful, thanks, Zelie. So, and you know, it's a really important bit of work, and it's great that there's a four-nation approach to that as well. So we're looking forward to sharing a bit more information about those info points that are available in other countries towards the end, because we do want to keep it focused, as I know you've probably, you know, read a lot of end of transition information, or, you know, seen it going about, and we know it can very easily become overwhelming. So we wanted to keep it nice and focused on short-term mobility and incoming mobility as well, so we can really try and tackle some of the questions that you kindly sent over when you were registering as well. So the solicitors have had a look at those, and we'll have time for handling those in the Q&A too. So without further ado, I would just like to say, please do turn off your video and microphone for now. We will have time at around 11:30 for a Q&A, where it'll be a bit more interactive, and you'll be able to ask the questions yourself or in the chat. So do feel free to use the chat if you're someone who's a bit shy and would just like to kind of ask questions in there. We can always bring those up, or I can also give you a bit of a spotlight at 11:30 to ask the questions yourself. So thanks so much for joining, and over to Gary and Shara. Oh, you may be muted, Shara or Gary, potentially. I can see the PowerPoint, Shara, but I think you might still be muted. Looks like you're muted.
So sorry, I've had to stop presenting in order to take myself off mute, which is
no
unhelpful.
problem.
Anyway, very good morning to everybody. Thank you very much for inviting us today. It's very nice to be with you, and hopefully we'll be able to answer a lot of the questions that were posed by the participants before today's session. So to give you an overview in terms of who we are, so myself and my colleague Gary McIndoe, we are from Latitude Law, who are specialist immigration solicitors, and we focus solely on inbound UK migration options. So from today's point of view, I'm going to spend the next sort of half an hour or so looking at some of the more short-term options that might be of relevance to those joining us today, that will really focus on things like the effectively the visitor routes. So how that might be a good way to sort of get round some of the logistical issues that are created by the Brexit problem. And then we'll be having a short break, and as Kate said, we'll be able to deal with some further questions and answers at that point. And then Gary will pick things up talking about sponsor licensing in a bit more detail, and about how that slightly more formal engagement might be of relevance if the visitor routes are not working. So we thought that we'd start today's presentation with just a short recap about why we have this need for a new approach. So obviously, as everybody knows, the implementation period will end at the end of this year. So we have Brexit fully taking effect at 11 p.m. on the 31st of December. And this obviously has a huge impact in terms of what that means for people arriving at our borders from 11:01. So in a nutshell, any new arrival to the UK from the EU after this period will potentially be subject now to immigration rules which have never troubled them before. And this is obviously a huge contrast to the current approach that we have with EU nationals, where we have currently this idea of free movement. So frictionless borders is sort of the buzz phrase at the moment, which will absolutely be gone, unfortunately, at the end of this year. Now, it's important to note that EU nationals are not going to become what are called visa nationals. Those are individuals who will need to have prior permission to enter the UK for any reason before their trip begins. But what it does mean is that EU nationals will still be able to enter the UK visa-free, but only for short-term trips. And the issue that we sort of perceive might arise from that is that this is really a seismic change in terms of how EU nationals will interact with our UK borders, but it might not feel any different because EU nationals as non-visa nationals will not need to get prior permission to come for a visit, which means they don't need to apply for anything beforehand. They don't necessarily need to see a border official on entry. They'll still be able to use e-gates, for example. And the risk that arises from that is that it means that there'll be all of these new restrictions that people are now subject to, but they won't necessarily know anything about them unless they either go out to find the information or organisations such as those joining us today have a conversation with them before travel. So it's unfortunately now going to be an area that is potentially ripe for some errors to be made, with people either entering for an inappropriate purpose or ultimately coming to the UK to do something that's no longer permitted. And what we're about to discuss now is effectively some of the restrictions that are placed on visitors, because these have real impact in relation to arts and cultural events. And there are some things that are absolutely permitted, but some things that are absolutely prohibited. Before we look at that in a bit more detail, I thought it would be worthwhile, and I know that this was raised by one of the participants in the questions before the session as well, about how Irish nationals might be affected by some of these changes. And I'm sure everybody will be very pleased to hear that ultimately there are very few changes, if any, that will affect Irish nationals. Irish citizens are and will remain subject to special arrangements in relation to that relationship between the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom. We share a common travel area, and what that means is that we have different restrictions and permissions that are applicable to Irish nationals that operate completely independently of their identity as remaining as EU nationals. So the short answer is there will be nothing needed in relation to Irish nationals. Irish nationals can still enter the UK after the 31st of December. They will not require specific permission to work or to live here. They can, if they wish, make applications to confirm UK status. That will be under what's called the EU Settled Status Scheme, which we will look at briefly a little later in today's presentation. But it's not essential for Irish nationals. So effectively, if you are dealing with Irish individuals or Irish groups who will be participating in events that you are arranging, there will be nothing special that now needs to happen in relation to those people. So that's one positive aspect, at least. In relation to everything else, of course, this has some pretty far-reaching implications for UK organisers of events. This sort of change from EU artists being able to travel freely to now being subject to restrictions is really going to impact how your events are organised, but also what those relationships with artists will be like. It's quite probable that you've potentially never spoken with people before about what their permission might be to enter the UK, or what they will or won't be doing, whether they'll be staying longer than your event, for example. Whereas now that will likely be a conversation that you have to have, and probably quite early into your organisation timeline. So it will be very important, we feel, for organisations to be very comfortable with what's permitted and what's not permitted, so that you can have those conversations, which at times might be a little bit awkward or a bit tricky, particularly when it comes to payment, for example, but that you have the information that you need so you can be confident that you're acting in an appropriate way, but also that the artists and other groups involved will know exactly what they're doing and can also be comfortable that they are meeting all of the requirements that will now be imposed on them. So the key point really that we will be focusing on, and this is really why, in effect, this whole session is probably required, is that where you have artists who will be remunerated or who will be directly sort of selling or providing goods to the public in the UK, there is likely going to be specific restrictions that are applied in relation to them. And it might mean that actually they need to apply for a specific visa as opposed to entering as visitors. So looking at one-off or short events to begin with. So if you have a very short event, it's quite likely that an artist would be able to enter the UK to attend that event without needing to be sponsored by any organisers. There are restrictions on travel for visitors, but generally speaking, they're quite generous. So entry for most visitors is permitted for up to 6 months at a time. There are some very, very specific restrictions to that itself, which actually reduces that time down to 1 month, which we'll talk about a little later on. But generally, the idea of 6 months is quite nice, free and easy. There aren't really any sort of checks that are employed on people while they're here. So if they enter via an e-gate, for example, and are just scanned in for a 6-month period, as far as the Home Office is concerned, they're not really bothered with that individual for that 6 months. They will just want them to make sure that they leave by the deadline. So it then puts, unfortunately, quite a lot of responsibility onto the individual to make sure that they are sticking within those requirements. One of those things is obviously about time, making sure that they do not remain in the UK for longer than the 6 months that are permitted, and also about making sure that they don't have repeated trips of such frequency that they are effectively living in the UK through these regular visits. The Home Office operates this sort of rule of thumb, rolling cumulative trip approach, whereby if you have a visitor who, for example, comes for 2 months, leaves for a couple of weeks, comes back for another 2 months, leaves for a couple of weeks, comes back for another 2 months, and that continues, at some point that is likely to flag within the Home Office system that this is an individual who's spending more than half of their time in the UK, and therefore is likely to actually require a longer term visa than this regular visitor trip. So it's always worth having a conversation with individuals to talk about not just the length of time that they intend to stay in any individual visit, but also cumulatively how much time they're spending in the UK. And if you're looking at more than 6 months in any rolling 12-month period, that might start to flag with the Home Office, and that might need to be a conversation about longer term options for that individual. In addition to these restrictions about time in the UK, visitors then also have these prohibitions and permissions in relation to activity. So if we look at some of the general ones, first of all. So periods of permitted entry are generally, as I say, 6 months for usual visitors, and then that reduces down to 1 month for what are called permitted paid engagement visitors. So those are visitors who are travelling for the specific purpose of taking part in an approved activity that will result in them receiving direct payment for their activities in the UK. In relation to all visitors, however, some things can be paid for. Things like cost of travel and accommodation can always be met by a third party as long as there is a genuine professional or personal relationship in existence between the visitor and who they are visiting. All visitors will also see general prohibitions in relation to work and payment, aside from these specific permissions, for example, permitted paid engagements that we'll look at in a bit more detail in a moment. So general provisions, if we stick with those first, in relation to prohibited activities in the UK, the rules are very prescriptive. You can see here the prohibited activities that relate to work, and these are taken directly from the current version of the immigration rules. And what I've done is just put in bold a few key points that might be relevant to the organisations that are joining this morning. As you can see, anything to do with taking employment, working for an organisation, or filling or providing short-term cover for an existing role is prohibited under the standard visitor rules. Now, what that means is that it's very, very difficult if there will be any sort of long-term position in the UK, even if an individual will only perform that role for very short periods, it's not generally allowed for that individual to do that in the UK as a visitor. So it means that if that's going to be the situation, you are potentially going to have to look at a longer term option along the lines of sponsorship, or reassess the activities that that individual will be carrying out in the UK. Now, obviously, taking employment is quite a long-standing, usually, but certainly quite a formal arrangement between a business or an organisation and an individual, and probably more commonly, the individuals with whom you will be dealing will not have that level of formal engagement. However, even where you do not have that sort of traditional employment relationship, there are still specific restrictions relating to payment, which may still trip people up. So reasonable expenses are permitted, but anything beyond that is not. So you can see this includes things like prize money, about billing somebody for time in the UK. So it starts to get into quite a murky area of the rules, unfortunately. Down at E and F, there are a couple of permitted times where an individual can be paid. So these are the permitted paid engagements, and also permit-free festivals, which again we'll have a look at in a bit more detail in a moment. But the thing that is quite difficult under the immigration rules, certainly what we find challenging as practitioners, and certainly in our experience, individuals find difficult to navigate, is that the wording of the rules can be quite unhelpful when it comes to determining, is something permitted or is it not? Because the immigration rules are so specific in saying you cannot do this, and then similarly specific in saying, but you can do this, where you have anything that falls in between those two extremes, that is a grey area that it's very then difficult to be able to advise whether something is completely permitted or completely prohibited. And this arises more commonly than you think, where something doesn't sort of feel as a comfortable fit within one of the permitted exceptions, but you know that it's not really a formal employment relationship. It can be very difficult to identify what is permitted and what is not. As far as you can, obviously, we would always recommend that people try and stick within strict wording of the immigration rules. Where it's not possible, it can often come down more specifically to sort of the spirit of what you're trying to achieve in the UK. The visitor rules are very much drafted from the point of view of limiting how much formal engagement an individual can have in the UK if they're only travelling on that short-term basis. So generally speaking, the more informal a relationship, the more likely it will be that the individual can then carry out that activity in the UK. 9 times out of 10, it's payment that then causes the question mark to be asked in relation to that activity. And obviously, it's always recommended that if you are in genuine doubt as to whether something is permitted, that you take some independent advice to try and have a slightly more comfortable feeling about how to proceed. In terms of activities then, which an individual can definitely perform, there are some that are specified in relation to just general visitors. So this isn't specific about the arts or cultural scene. The thing that will probably be most relevant to the individuals that you and your organisations will be dealing with is this idea about giving one-off or short series of talks or speeches. And I know that there was a question in the details that were provided before this session that specifically asked about this, and was it okay to have an individual attending a series of talks if they've been organised as a commercial enterprise. But as you can see, in relation to what's highlighted there in B, the general permission given to talks and speeches is provided they are not organised as commercial events that will not make a profit for the organiser. So again, it's very, very easy, even in relation to these permitted activities, to suddenly start to stray into areas where actually the rules will not permit something or will start to make things a lot more difficult to negotiate. So for that reason, specifically in relation to the creative field, the Home Office have specified specific things that are permitted. So these will hopefully answer a lot of the questions that were asked in relation to those kind of Q&As before the event. And then we'll get into a bit more detail about some of the other specific exceptions to payment, which might also be of value. So creative routes generally cover artists, entertainers and musicians, as you can see. And where you have an individual falling into one of those 3 categories, they have quite a lot of freedom to carry out what you would, I suppose, consider to be their normal activities in the UK. So as you can see, they're able to give performances, they can take part in competitions and auditions, make personal appearances and promotional activities. In D, you also have the ability for them to take part in cultural events or festivals which are on the permit-free list. And then we also have some very specific exceptions that relate to personal and technical staff and production teams, and also to film crews, which is quite a popular aspect of the visit visa rules that are used in the UK for location shooting, for example. So those specific permitted activities for creative are very useful in providing guidance as to whether or not the organisation, the event, whatever it is that you are hoping to host in the UK, is likely to fit into one of these activities. That will only answer half of the question, however, because it will only answer the part about can the individual carry out this activity in the UK. It will not yet answer the question of can the individual be paid to take part in the UK. So looking at the two specific exceptions then that permit payment in the UK. The first is permitted paid engagements. And as you can see here, these are reserved for professional entertainers, musicians, sports people, etc., who will be carrying out an activity that is directly relevant to their specific profession. This only relates to events where there has been a specific UK organiser who is inviting that individual to that creative event in the UK. So the value of permitted paid engagements is that they act as an exception to this general rule that prohibits payment for what would otherwise be this individual's ordinary activities in the UK. This is, of course, therefore, very, very useful to identifying whether you can invite somebody to the UK after Brexit takes effect and then pay them for their time. But it's really important in relation to permitted paid engagements to take note of the restrictions that are applicable to that particular route. The word in that first bullet point, as you can see, is professional, and that is an intentional addition into this particular section. It is only reserved for established professionals. You also have this requirement that the activity needs to directly relate to that person's profession. So ancillary events might sometimes start to get a little bit complicated. And then also this idea about the invitation from a creative organisation, which naturally is going to be on you and your organisations to arrange. Now, what that looks like is relatively informal. So individuals who are travelling as permitted paid engagements, they will normally need to travel with an invitation letter from the organisation that is arranging the event in the UK that will just set out what that person is being engaged to do. So details of the event, dates, what the purpose of it is, who the organisation is that is inviting this individual, and what that individual will do and how they will be paid in relation to their activities in the UK. So if you have something that's short term, permitted paid engagements is quite a neat way to be able to invite somebody to the UK without needing to involve yourself and your organisation in the slightly more complicated aspects of sponsorship that my colleague Gary will be looking at in a few moments. The thing about permitted paid engagements, however, that needs to be remembered is that this is the restriction that limits down that period of time that visitors are permitted to spend in the UK. So permitted paid engagements reduce that general 6 months free and easy permission down to the 1 month strict permission in the UK. So for most events, that will be sufficient. But obviously, if you're talking about quite a long-term festival that might be covering, sort of 6 to 8 weeks or even longer, then permitted paid engagements isn't going to cover an individual for the full duration of that particular event. Permit-free festivals might be the answer to that particular query. So permit-free festivals are what they sound like effectively. So it's a festival that has been approved by the Home Office to be able to offer an opportunity for artists, entertainers, musicians to come to the UK and to receive payment in relation to their activities in the UK without the need for some kind of permit, some kind of work permit to be here. Now, the thing that's interesting about permit-free festivals when you contrast with permitted paid engagements is, again, that first bullet point, if you look at the bold words, the absence of the word professional in relation to permit-free festivals. So festivals that fit under this scheme have much more scope to invite a more diverse group of individuals to the UK. It does not necessarily need to be people who are so well established within their particular field of expertise. Note as well that permit-free festivals allows an individual to come to the UK to participate in one or more of these events. So if you think about sort of summer festival season, it's absolutely foreseeable that you will have an individual who might be engaged with several festivals dotted around the United Kingdom. And that's absolutely fine as long as all of these festivals are permit-free. Individuals who are travelling and entering the UK under this particular facet of the visit rules are not restricted down to that 1 month that you see for permitted paid engagements. So again, much more freedom for these individuals to actually have more participation in more events. The difficulty with permit-free festivals is getting onto the list. So we currently have 41 permit-free festivals in the UK. I have included a link in that slide, which I know will be available to everybody after today's session, which will allow you to see the types of festivals that are included on the list, and also gives you information in terms of how the Home Office would like you to apply to join that list. Unfortunately, if you have a festival that's taking part in the next couple of months, it might be challenging, as the current list, they run from April to April, so the current list will be expiring on the 6th of April 2021. Just bear in mind that the deadline for applications, which I have to say I couldn't see was published, which is why it's not included on this slide, but the deadline for the last application route was January of 2020, so it may well be the case that it's January 2021. However, what I would say is that the Home Office is likely to have some level of understanding about the impact of the end of free movement in relation to arts and cultural events in the UK. And so hopefully I would expect and I would anticipate some slight flexibility in terms of applications to join the permit-free festival list. So certainly if you're planning a festival for next year that you think actually it would be very beneficial for us to be a permit-free festival, so we can invite a different group of people from around, or rather from outside the UK, then certainly I would recommend having a look at the information about joining that permit-free list and then making the appropriate application as soon as you can do. So those are some of the options in terms of who might qualify in relation to visas, but what about individuals who absolutely are not going to qualify? So first of all, a point that is very important and that Gary will be looking at in a little bit more detail in the second section of our presentation is just a general warning, I suppose, in relation to the rules that are applicable for visitors. Now, to date, EU nationals entering the UK have, of course, been subject to some regulation in relation to their residence here. And there have been restrictions in relation to individuals' suitability and criminality for entering the UK. But under free movement provisions, those are quite lax. Once EU nationals migrate to being under our sort of standard immigration rules, we are seeing simplification, and also some slight tightening up in relation to those suitability and criminality requirements for entrance to the UK. And unfortunately now it is foreseeable that there might be some EU nationals who previously have had no difficulty in entering the UK before, but actually might fall foul of some of the new restrictions that will be applicable to them. The other thing to bear in mind is that visitors, obviously in the creative field, have got some flexibility in terms of how they can receive payment and how many events they can participate in. But those restrictions are still limiting and they're not going to fit absolutely everybody. A couple of examples on that slide: amateur artists don't fit into the permitted paid engagement exception, for example, and festivals which are not admitted onto the permit-free list don't have that ability to be able to pay individuals who are only visiting the UK. So where those apply, it's really important that there are alternatives that are considered to the visitor route. That might be securing something like sponsorship. So it might be that your organisation needs to take a sponsor licence to then support creative migrants to the UK. It might be that there are alternative immigration routes that are applicable, and we'll have a look at one of those in the second session as well, which might be of relevance to those joining us today. But it's just worthwhile considering, as convenient as it is for EU nationals to enter the UK without needing to apply for anything in advance and being here as visitors, not every scenario is going to meet that requirement. And if you have an individual who, for example, receives payment in the UK and that is in breach of the visitor rules, that is an issue for the individual, of course, because they have breached immigration restrictions. In that case, if they are then removed from the UK, they could be banned from return to the UK for several years in certain circumstances. But also it can have a huge impact on an organisation as well. If an organisation is identified by the Home Office as having actually employed an individual who does not have permission to work in that way in the UK, then the organisation can be subject to a fine of up to £20,000. And if there is evidence that there has been a deliberate act to actually carry out or create that employment relationship where there was knowledge that the individual would not have permission to work in that way, it can actually also open the organisation and the individuals involved in that organisation up to criminal proceedings. So it is actually crucial to be comfortable and confident that the organisation that you're putting in place in relation to your events is within the rules that you're choosing to be subject to. So as I say, if you think that actually this might not qualify as a visitor, always at least explore the other options, and then you can at least make an informed decision as to which is the best fit. So we're just going to finish up in relation to this sort of visitor section by just looking at a short case study that might hopefully help to put some of these ideas into context and then work out how that might be applicable to your own events in the UK. So just for the avoidance of any doubt, this does not relate to anybody specific. I have just plucked names from thin air. So if it relates to anybody that you are familiar with, it's not intended to, and this doesn't relate to any real people at all. So Shelley and Christopher are nationals of France and are both accomplished dancers. They each plan to take part in a 3-day arts festival, which will take place in the UK in March of 2021. This festival is not included on the list of permit-free festivals in the immigration rules. Both Shelley and Christopher will be paid for their participation, and the festival organisers require confirmation of how Shelley and Christopher can now receive remuneration for their activities in the UK in relation to this festival. Now, first of all, we're going to talk about Shelley. So Shelley, as a French national, is already living in the UK. She moved here at the start of December 2020, and she intends to settle in the UK long term if she can. By contrast, Christopher is a full-time resident in France. He will only travel to the UK for the purpose of this festival, so he'll only be here for a period of about 1 week. Shelley is going to be the most straightforward individual that this organisation could deal with, that organisations such as your own would be able to deal with. She will not require sponsorship. She will see no restrictions in terms of her eligibility to be paid, and that completely relates to her status as an EU national resident in the UK before the end of this Brexit implementation period. For individuals who already live in the UK or who are relocating to the UK before the end of this year, they are not going to be subject to these new immigration rules. They instead will be able to continue to benefit from the free movement that brought them to the UK in the first place. There will be a requirement that they apply for registration of their status in the UK. The deadline on that slide, as you can see there, is the end of June 2021. But if you have an individual that you are confident has relocated to the UK before 11 p.m. on the 31st of December 2020, that individual will be able to continue living in the UK. Christopher doesn't apply, obviously, in relation to this. So he is not going to be resident in the UK pre-Brexit. Therefore, he is going to fall under these immigration rules and will require some kind of permission to enter the UK. Now, obviously, as we've discussed already this morning, the easiest option for Christopher would be to enter as a visitor. He wouldn't need a visa in advance in order to do that. He could just turn up at the border on the day with his French national passport and be admitted as a visitor. But of course, in order to know whether that will fit for Christopher and for the organisation, we'll need to consider, can he then be paid to carry out his activities in the UK? Now, his planned activities, as we know, are within the scope of permitted activities for a creative visitor. So the actual participation in the festival is not going to be an issue. He's going to be carrying out activities as a dancer, which is obviously his chosen profession. Receiving payment for his participation, however, would ordinarily be prohibited because all payment is generally prohibited under the visitor rules. This means that we will need to identify one of the exemptions to that payment restriction for Christopher to receive remuneration for his involvement. We already know that the festival is not permit free, so that option will not be available to us. However, Christopher is an established professional dancer. So if this organisation issues a formal invitation to join this festival, then he can be admitted as a permitted paid engagement visitor. That will permit Christopher to receive remuneration in relation to his participation in this festival. And it will also mean, however, that he will face greater restriction on his time in the UK. So it's going to reduce that standard 6-month time down to the 1 month that is permitted for permitted paid engagement visitors. Now, that's in line with Christopher's plans. We know that he's only intending to stay for a week, so that's no issue. As a result, that means that Christopher would be able to travel to the UK. He will not need a visa in order to enter the UK, but what he will need is confirmation that he has been invited under permitted paid engagement. So he will need that sort of formal invitation letter from the organisation, just setting everything out. And so long as he sticks then within all the restrictions, that will be permitted and the festival can proceed as planned. So that's sort of the level that we were hoping to cover in relation to these short-term visitors in the UK. We are on 10 to 11. So Kate, I don't know whether that might be an opportunity that you wanted to allow just for a short Q&A in relation to there's anything specific to those routes, or whether there are any other speakers who might want to add their personal experiences about dealing with perhaps permit-free festivals or with permitted paid engagement exceptions.
Thanks so much, Shara. That's been really great. And well, it's a lot to cover. So really appreciate you kind of cramming it all into, kind of half an hour presentation. We've had some questions in the chat, so we might run through some of these. And I think you might have then answered some of it in your case study or in presentations, but I think it's always good to have kind of clear answers where clarity is possible. So I might just pose some of those questions that have come up in the chat, and then what we might do is give you a bit of a break and see if Dan and Taghrid would like to kind of just chip in any of their experiences too. So first I'll just take a look at the first question. So, and this is a really good one. Is there a particular threshold to meet for judging whether an artist is professional? And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, and unfortunately, I don't think it's a term that's really defined in relation to the immigration rules. The one thing that we do know, however, is we're able to use our experience and our knowledge from other areas of the rules in relation to, generally speaking, how this comes up. And it comes up a lot in relation to sports people, as you can imagine, that sort of distinction between amateur and professional, because, again, sports faces all of the same restrictions as the creative sector does as well. So when it comes to sports people, the threshold is very low in relation to where somebody will then be caught as being a professional. So the argument really ought to be that, well, in that case, it should be a similarly low threshold. So if somebody is effectively able to receive some kind of engagement, some sort of paid engagement in relation to their activities, then there would likely be an argument that that person is therefore acting as a professional. It might not be their full-time profession. They may well supplement their income in other ways, but if they're able to actually receive remuneration for activities in the UK, then I would argue that you're always going to be able to at least get off the ground and looking at how professional somebody is. Gary, I don't know whether you've maybe got separate thoughts in relation to that.
Morning, everybody. Hi, I'm Gary. I think that's right, Shara. Just looking at the rules define for a sports person what's professional, but they don't do the same for a creative worker. So I think we can safely assume that there's a lot of discretion available there. So, somebody posed the question about, how would the Home Office look at an emerging artist? I think that there's a case to be made, isn't there, for that person being considered professional. Whether they're established professional, it kind of gets a bit more nuanced, I suppose, doesn't it? But I think yes, it's largely going to be on the shoulders of organisations like yours, I think, to kind of explain and justify, because remember, you're dealing with civil servants who, this isn't their thing. So you're in a position of kind of much greater knowledge and expertise, and you can you can persuade with your arguments, I think, that that somebody should be treated as a professional creative individual. Yeah.
That's and I can understand that it's one of those kind of grey areas, but as you say, kind of if they're able to receive payment for activity and they're being invited by an organisation that also has an established track record in the UK. We might come to Dan and Taghrid in a little bit actually about that one too. So just to see kind of if they have any experience of what kind of evidence that's been put together. Hopefully this is so this one's from Dan. If someone enters for a permit-free festival, can they then also perform at another paid event for another organisation?
I think it depends on what kind of the setup is for the other organisation, really. So with permit-free festivals, you can sort of hop in terms of moving from one permit-free festival to the other. I don't think necessarily that there would be a problem in relation to sort of participating in a permit-free festival and a permitted paid engagement. But obviously just remember that you're going to have that really restricted period of time that the individual can be in the UK if they're in any way being involved in a permitted paid engagement. So it will come down to a month. So obviously there's always going to be less scope in relation to that, because they'll have less ability to be able to stay in the UK long term, to be able to hop from one thing to the other.
Yeah, and do feel free to, if there's certain questions that you'd like to come back to us on, obviously we've said to attendees that we can send through some Q&As after the event as well in wrap up. So because I guess that, the question would be, would they have to kind of go out and come in to start that PPE, for example? So that might be. Yeah,
that might be one that we we'll double check it. It's fine.
Could I just jump in and say thanks to Pamela Walker, who's very kindly notified us that the application period for permit-free festivals inclusion on the list is now open, and will be until kind of mid-January. So and that information is all in the chat there. So that's really helpful. The Home Office web page does give the kind of parameters that the Home Office are looking at for inclusion on the permit-free festival list. It's not every kind of village fete that's going to be eligible. Unfortunately, there are certain kind of minimum audience requirements, and you've also had to kind of have engaged in booking overseas artists as well in the past. So there are kind of bars to be met when you're looking at inclusion on the festival list.
Yeah, and a certain cost as well to applying, isn't that? That's right, isn't it? So one other question, I think this was kind of answered, but just to clarify, can a festival pay a professional as a PPE if the festival isn't permit free? So if the festival isn't permit free, PPE, I guess, is the way of being
that would be possible. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, it's basically PPE is for festivals that aren't permit free, but then you've got that limitation of 1 month. There is how I'm learning it myself. Right. There's quite a few comments coming in, so we might I might have to go and digest some of these and come back to you. I think, Mary, we looked at established professionals, so that how many PPEs can happen within a 12-month period? That's a good question. Are you restricted to coming in with a PPE? And
I think that's basically going to depend on compliance with the visit. The kind of disguised residence thing that Shara mentioned, the fact that you're not, you shouldn't really be spending, and this is only a rule of thumb. It's not an absolute rule, but kind of 6 months in any 12-month period should be your kind of marker, really, I think.
Okay, so you want to be kind of cautious about anything that could be perceived as basically establishing your activity mainly in the UK or something similar to that. Okay.
Yeah.
Does an organisation need to be a registered charity, or can it be an independent artist writing this invitation letter? So I guess that's a question around permitted paid engagements, the person writing the invitation letter there.
Certainly doesn't have to be a charity, does it, Shara? I'm not sure about an individual. I'm not sure how that would go down.
That might be another one, Kate, that I'll just check and see whether the guidance actually defines organisation. I feel like it doesn't, but I will just double check whether the guidance on it actually defines what they class as an organisation for that purpose. Because it's not defined in the rules, I don't think. So it may well be in guidance if it is.
That's great, thank you. So we can take a note of that question and get back to you, Hannah. Pierre. Looking at too many questions at once. Great. I'm seeing some other questions. They're all coming through. What we might do is we do have a big slot kind of set aside for some of these questions a little bit later on after Gary's presentation, and it might be good to kind of have the tier 5 added into the mix too, and then we've got the whole picture. But before we do, I'd just like to virtually pop over to Dan and Taghrid and see if would you like to kind of share any insights as to kind of working with some of these routes and just perhaps your thought processes of how it's been working with artists and other professionals in the past when you've been looking at visitors or permitted paid engagements. I know like a lot of your experience sits with Tier 5. But yes, if there's anything you'd like to chip in there, Daniel or Taghrid.
Sure. Taghrid, would you like to go first or shall I?
I'm spotlighting you as well.
Oh, go for it.
Okay, thanks. Well, firstly, thanks so much to Creative Scotland and the Creative Europe Desk for organising this. I've been putting lots of questions in the chat, which shows, I think, how useful this is and how, unfortunately, how complicated it can be, the world of visas. And I know we're going to talk about Tier 5 in a moment, but if you think Tier 3 is bad, wait until you get to Tier 5. But we will talk about that later on. And as Kate mentioned, Tier 5 is probably where most of our experience sits in. I'm the director of English Pen, and English Pen was involved in lobbying for the creation of the permitted paid engagement visa. And that has made a marked change, and primarily on people working with artists coming from outside of the EU. Prior to being director of English Pen, I was also a co-director of the Shubbak festival, and we hosted many artists from across Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Some of them would come through on the permitted paid engagement route. That generally would apply, if I was going to be blunt, to artists coming from countries that we felt had a greater chance of success coming in. So I would include all European countries within that, depending on the status of the artist within the country as it stands. We would generally look at gathering as much proof as we could of their professional nature. So that would be press cuttings, primarily actually press cuttings, and occasionally copies of brochures or catalogs or festival catalogs showing their engagement and their presence, ideally on an international level, but if not possible also from within the country that they're applying from. Generally had a fairly good route of success with that, but as said, if someone was coming from what we thought might be of a slightly more complex visa background, we would lean towards Tier 5 visa. A question which I put in the chat was whether EU nationals will need to apply in country beforehand, or if they'll be able to get a permitted paid engagement visa on the border, because there was two routes previously for permitted paid engagement visas. So those who were able to come, say, people with US passports or Australian passports could, as far as I understand, pick up a permitted paid engagement visa on the border, whereas people coming from, for example, Morocco would have to apply in country. And it'd be really interesting just to hear what the status will be moving forward on that. Taghrid, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I mainly, I think my comments could be helpful in terms of Tier 5 sponsorship. When I joined Shubbak, I think both our directors, Dan, who's just spoken, and Eckhart Thiemann had kind of set the landscape for us to become a Tier 5 sponsor. So I think I'd like to kind of save my contributions to looking at kind of practical and streamlined routes for organizations to follow to enable kind of the easiest and most pain-free, but it'll always be painful, ways to support artists with this process.
Maybe one thing I'll just jump in on is actually, sorry, the permit-free festival list, because that always felt to me from outside, from a non-permit free festival, as if it would be a holy grail to get on. And I think it is definitely worth exploring if you are a festival that would qualify for it. But sadly, it is not the holy grail that I thought it may be at first, as we've seen many examples of permit-free festivals still having artists not get their visas to attend. So it's worth thinking through very carefully what route is best for the artist for your event.
That's great, thanks, guys. And I think when we were talking in preparation for this event as well, it was some part of it is also clear that you know, it is a complex system. So even when you've been working in it for a very long time, it's hard to feel like an expert at any point, because it can be so, well, it changes a lot, and also it depends on the individual circumstances of the people that you're inviting in. But yeah, we'll come back to you as well, because I think I'm also particularly interested on what you touched on before. Is obviously, you know, we're working with human beings and artists and cultural professionals that we want to have these amazing creative relationships with, and connections and experiences and so on when we bring them and invite them over and host them, and so that can be quite at odds sometimes with the system we're trying to help them navigate. So yeah, we'll come back to that. There are a lot of I think I might come back to you, Shara, briefly, just with a few more questions, and then we can head on to Gary's presentation. So I was just wondering, actually, with that kind of question on permitted paid engagements and where you need to apply for that. So yeah, exactly. Where do you apply? Can you apply from? Can the artist apply kind of before they arrive in the country, and can you help them with that, or does it need to be done at the border? Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, it can be done at either is the short answer, but where it will be EU nationals, because they are going to fall under the category of non-visa nationals, that means that they don't have to apply for visit visas in order to travel. They can just arrive at border and apply at border, and that will apply equally to permitted paid engagements as it would to any other type of visit visa. So they absolutely can just travel and make sure that they've got the right documentation with them and should then be admitted at the border. The only time where we would normally advise somebody who might be visa-free normally, but they would benefit perhaps from making an application, is sometimes where somebody has a slightly more complicated immigration history, or they might have a criminal conviction, and it makes sense to try and address those issues before the person actually incurs the cost of travel effectively. So normally, I would imagine for the vast majority of individuals that the organisations joining today will be dealing with, if they're EU nationals, they'll be able to just travel and then apply at border, and that will be acceptable. The other point that Dan raised about people sort of not getting their visas when you would ordinarily expect them to do so, yeah, it's an absolutely excellent point, and it was something that was covered quite well in sort of national media over, not so much this year because nothing took place anyway, but over the last kind of couple of years, in relation to particularly musicians quite commonly not being permitted to enter. I think there was also one of the literary festivals had a huge problem in terms of visitors not getting their visit visa in order to enter. So it is always something that absolutely needs to be sort of taken quite seriously in relation to applying for a visa. I think, I'm sure Gary would agree, one of the things that we quite commonly experience as practitioners is when somebody wants to apply for a visit visa, then they'll kind of say to us, oh, but it's, you know, it's only a visit, so it's not going to be a big deal. You know, surely I'll get it. Surely the Home Office won't need this much information. Surely they won't need that much evidence. But it's not the case, unfortunately. Visitor visa applications look and feel very similar to applications in longer term and you know, and settlement routes. Very similar application forms and very similar levels of evidence that are required. So if you do have somebody who will be, particularly if they're applying for a visa in advance, so perhaps if they're traveling from outside of the European Union, from one of the countries that is not able to benefit from this idea of visa-free travel for visitors, it needs to be an application that's properly prepared, that's submitted in good time, that will give you the opportunity that in the event of refusal, if there's some kind of challenge that can be made, then that can also be pursued in good time for the event. It's never really going to work very well if you're sort of applying for people to have visit visas, you know, a week before your event is taking place.
That's a good point.
If I could just chip in, yeah, Dan, thanks for reminding me of that article. I also remember that article. I mean, that's an issue for visa nationals, which EU citizens aren't going to be. You know, the idea that you apply in your own country and you get refused a visa by a UK visa officer abroad. So that's not going to be an issue for EU citizens coming in the permitted paid engagement route, for example. You know, they're just going to be able to turn up at the border. They don't need to apply for anything. There's no cost. Don't need to apply for a visa. They're just entering as a visitor, just in the same way that any you know, US or Australian national would, coming for whatever reason. But with the PPE, all they need really is the invitation, you know, the invitation letter from the organisation, or the festival or the event that they're coming to attend.
That's great. And I think Dan's going to, I'll ask Dan a little bit later around, there is a closed Google group which has been quite good at sharing templates for letters of invitation. I hope, Dan, you don't mind me kind of sharing that right now. If people are interested, I'll get him to talk about that a little bit more, because sometimes it's just helpful to have a starting point for some of these kind of you know, processes and see how people have approached it before. So I'm going to enlist my colleague Rosie to help navigate some of the questions, because we have had quite a few popping up. So I think we'll do another kind of 5-ish minutes going through questions, and then we'll move on to Gary's presentation.
Sure, thanks, Kate. So there's been a couple of questions about payment for people participating in work when they're not actually leaving their country. So, for example, Andrea Montgomery said she's wondering about payment for short online participation in creative work when they're staying in their home country. Is there any thoughts about that?
I mean, that's not going to raise any kind of UK migration issues. So, you know, they're working remotely from their own country. That's absolutely fine. The Home Office is only really interested in people who are going to, you know, be physically present in the UK.
Great, thanks. Cass James has asked if an artist is coming over for a month's residency that is not paid, so their wages have been covered by their home organisation, but they wanted to cover travel and accommodation, would a visa be needed?
Not usually, no. So if they're receiving no sort of remuneration other than what are reasonable living expenses, then just kind of going back to some of the earlier slides, there is that kind of general permission for somebody to have the costs of their visit covered. So if it's going to be, as I say, reasonable expenses, so sort of no I guess putting them up at the Ritz or something, but if there's a general kind of a genuine professional relationship between the individual that's traveling and the organisation that's invited them to come, and then it's just their expenses that are being covered that are reasonable, then technically that should be able to fit within visitor rules. And then provided that individual is a non-visa national, so for example an EU national, then they wouldn't need to apply for prior permission. With that kind of thing, that's probably the area where it's kind of easiest to sort of start to stumble into kind of crossing from one boundary to the other about what's permitted and what's not. So it just needs some quite careful consideration really in terms of exactly what's going to be paid, how it's going to be paid, and what it's covering to make sure that it does fit.
I think that's a really good point. I think quite a few people who are running Creative Europe projects who are part of the chat, they may have the sending organisation from the country, you know, covering an artist fee, but perhaps then booking travel and accommodation themselves. There may sometimes be a subsistence like allowance. So it's interesting that you were talking about kind of a basic daily rate was permitted. Is that so that's correct? So you can pay some kind of, or give some kind of subsistence to people visiting.
Yeah, so they allow you to cover reasonable expenses. So maybe one of the things that would be quite useful for us to share sort of after the session is any kind of guidance that's available from the Home Office about what they consider to be reasonable expenses, kind of what's covered, what's not, because that sounds like that would be something of interest to people. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, great. Rosie, any other?
There's one interesting question here. So from Nod Knowles from the European Folk Network is asking if on a tour less than 1 month, who is the inviter? Do they need invites from every single tour date promoter?
This might be something that, I don't know, Gary, perhaps that you're going to sort of talk about in more detail in relation to your...
Yeah, that sounds more like a Tier 5 sponsorship arrangement, that. So yeah, I'll cover that in a minute.
Okay, great.
To be continued.
So a couple of people have asked, is there a route to appeal a refused PPE visa?
No, is kind of the short answer to that. Not in the traditional sense of, I would like somebody independent to look over this decision and tell me what they think. So visitors don't have a right of appeal, generally speaking, in relation to refusals. What you can do is you can contact the Home Office to basically outline what you think are the issues with it. So the problem with it is it's the starting point for much larger litigation, which obviously for the vast majority of individuals who are travelling as visitors, we're not necessarily going to advise that, oh yeah, large scale litigation in the High Court is the way for you to address this as an issue. However, the opening stages of that litigation is just direct dialogue between the individual or their representative and the Home Office to try and get them to re-engage with that decision and to sort of either justify what they've said and why, or to answer any concerns that have been raised in relation to how that decision's been made and the findings that they have given. So, we have experience and success in relation to overturning visitor refusals on that basis, but it's not a traditional appeal as such. So it's not the case of it's just a straightforward process to follow and you'll receive a decision within 5 days, sort of thing.
Great. And I think I'll just bunch up one final question and then we'll move on to Gary's presentation. And we'll still have plenty of time at the end to mop up more questions too. But I saw basically a cluster of questions around permitted paid engagement and what that, firstly, what does that actually look like is a piece of paper, and secondly, when is it given? So if you're coming through EE gates, do you actually have to go and talk to a border person in order to kind of obtain that? And also, is it £95, and is that kind of the same for whether you're an EU EEA citizen or whether you're someone else who would be a visa national? Is that the kind of cost involved? So yeah, those kind of questions of what does it actually look like? Is it a bit of paper? Yeah.
So it depends on who's applying. So if you have somebody who's applying from a visa national country, so somebody from outside the EU, from outside kind of those what the Home Office would consider to be safe countries for visitors to come from, so places like the US and Australia, etc. So where you've got people from outside of those countries who have to apply for a visit visa before they get on that plane to come to the UK, then yeah, it's an actual physical thing. So it's called a vignette. It's a stamp that goes into the passport. They're yellow, they have a picture of the individual on, and then it confirms the basis that person has been granted. So it'll have an issue date, an expiry date by which time the person needs to leave the UK, and it will confirm on it the type of visa that they have been given. So where you've got somebody that's making that formal application, it's kind of a nice tangible thing, if you like, to kind of confirm all the details. Where you've got somebody that's just entering at border, so you've got, for example, a French national who's literally just hopped on the Eurostar and is then arriving, then e-gates is sort of the slight thorn in our side at the moment, because they will be able to use an e-gate. They would be admitted under an e-gate, but obviously e-gates are not particularly sophisticated in terms of determining who gets admitted entry and who doesn't. They don't result in a stamp in a passport, so there'll literally be nothing that's given. If an individual is seen instead, then a physical stamp is normally placed in the passport, so like an actual ink stamp that will confirm when that person is permitted entry, so the date that they are admitted and then the duration of their entry. Gary, I don't know whether you've got thoughts about whether e-gates would be inadvisable for a PPE visitor, because I'm not sure that there's anything that formally says they cannot be used by a PPE visitor.
I'm not aware of anything that prevents use of an e-gate, so I'd always recommend using an e-gate. You run the risk, I suppose. Some people get pulled at random by when they go through an e-gate and are required to speak to a border force officer. In that situation, you're fine. You just need to present your invitation, I think, and then you should be on your way.
So you don't necessarily have. I guess you would want to perhaps have evidence of the date at which you came in, though, so that you were able to show that it was for that specific month of PPE. And I guess you're more likely to have evidence if you're not going through an e-gate. Would that be the kind of reason?
You're always going to have that, aren't you, with your travel ticket? So just just keep that kind of stuff in your emails, I suppose. But that's going to be adequate. The Home Office has kind of taken a risk-based approach to the use of e-gates. You know, it knows that there'll be some people coming in through e-gates who, you know, perhaps aren't entitled to, or perhaps are pushing the limits of their kind of disguised residence in the UK. But honestly, that's the, you know, that's the way it goes, isn't it? That's the risk they take, you know, by introducing this more efficient border system, I suppose. And they, you know, they understand that. So, you know, yeah. So
and for paying that £95, so would that apply to EU EEA nationals as well? And at what point would you pay that?
No. I mean, that's the fee for the visa. If you need a prior visa to come to the UK, so for EU nationals, that's not going to apply.
Great. Okay. Nice clarification there. So it's a description of the nature in which you're coming into the country. But it's not going to be a bit of paper and a payment that's connected to it. Fab. Thank you. Clarification is what we need, because there's a lot of information going around. So thanks.
It's quite tricky, I think, because there are so many scenarios, and I'm looking at the chat, and I'm getting a little bit overwhelmed by the chat, you know, because there are so many different examples, or you know, different ways organisations invite people and people come here, and it's it's a little bit of a minefield, I have to say.
Absolutely, and don't try not to get too overwhelmed by the chat, because we'll keep an eye on that, and any questions that we're not able to answer, we can make sure we send through to you, and we perhaps have a little discussion about some of those too. So yes, anyway, on to your kind of presentation of tier 5 and other routes, Gary, and then we'll have more time for questions later on, and then also a little bit of a kind of insight from Dan and Taghrid as well.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Kate. I think I've got control of the slides, but it's not working. I don't know how I do it now. Any technical assistance available? It says I have control, but I can't do anything. I just got
you do. Do you want me to have control? I'm very happy to have control if you want me.
I'm going to feel like Chris Whitty telling you, say next slide.
I can live with that if that's easiest.
Next slide, please.
Right, I have control. Go for it.
Go on, carry on.
So actually, I'm dealing with this, aren't I, to begin with? Anyway, so it probably makes sense for me to start.
I can cover it, Shara. It's fine. It's fine. Okay.
You sure?
Okay, so licensing. As Dan mentioned earlier, this is what a lot of organisations have already done, and perhaps more are going to have to do. Organisations who've you know, in the past sponsored people from outside the EU, artists and performers from outside the EU to come to the UK on a regular basis have often opted to get a tier 5 sponsor license, and that allows them to sponsor individuals coming into the UK for short-term purposes. So you contrast tier 5 short-term with tier 2, which is the longer-term sponsor license route. That's only going to be relevant really in today's context, I suppose, for organizations who are recruiting people who are going to work for them, you know, on a long-term basis, maybe arts administrators or officials, you know, that kind of thing, who are coming over from overseas. The cost of a license relatively low. It goes up a lot if you're a large organisation, but that 536 figure that applies to registered charities, no matter how large they are. Excuse me. And the idea with sponsor licensing is that you, as an organisation, are required to take on certain duties and responsibilities in relation to bringing over overseas workers or individuals to the UK. You are kind of vouching for those individuals, and that's the whole point of the sponsorship system, is the Home Office is kind of devolving responsibility onto organisations to kind of monitor activities, to make sure also that you've got your own kind of recruitment, your own admin processes are all in order. It's possible when you apply for the first time for a sponsor license, that you could be subject to a compliance visit. That's Home Office officials coming in, sometimes physically, sometimes remotely these days, to assess your processes and procedures. So while a license application, it's quite a simple thing to do. You just go to gov.uk and search sponsor license TIF T5, as they've now rebranded it rather racily. Then you can find the starting point, and you can go through the various online pages of the application. It takes about 30 minutes. It's a really straightforward thing. But what you have to remember is you may have to think about documents that you need to put together to support your application, and you have to bear in mind as well the possibility of a compliance visit, so some scrutiny of your processes by Home Office officials. Okay, next slide please, Shara. So once you have your license, you will have requested an allocation of what are called certificates of sponsorship. Now these are virtual documents, and they are held by your organisation, and they are issued by your organisation, or technically they are they're given to the individuals you want to sponsor in a process called assigning. So you assign your certificates of sponsorship to individuals as and when you need to. The cost of an individual cost or certificate of sponsorship is very cheap. In the T5 category, it's just £21 per certificate. Some of the advantages of T5 sponsorship as opposed to longer term not T2 skilled worker sponsorship are that you don't pay kind of broader charges that are applicable to long-term hires. The immigration skills charge is kind of £1,000 a year charge that's imposed where you're sponsoring somebody long term. So T5, you're not having to deal with any of that kind of cost. Okay, next slide. So these are the parameters, really very broadly set out in the immigration rules. There's a lot more detail contained in guidance and also in what are called the codes of practice, which are contained in the immigration rules. But this is a kind of starting point, really. Somebody can make a unique contribution to UK's cultural life, and those are, the kind of basic parameters, really. So it is somebody who perhaps already has a profile. I mean, Dan mentioned when allocating Tier 5 certificates of sponsorship in the past, they've kind of put together a kind of almost a portfolio, really, of the individual for the purpose of a visa application. And I think that's quite a good approach, really, for those kind of higher risk nationalities, maybe perhaps not so significant or not so necessary for somebody applying from the EU, from an EU member state, but perhaps good practice, really, to put together that kind of evidence of the individual's profile. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is a slide. This, I think, perhaps came up in one of the questions on the chat. This idea that you don't actually need to apply for a visa in T5 if you're a non-visa national. It's possible, and it has been in the past as well, for non-visa nationals, to simply be allocated a cost by a UK sponsor under T5, and for that person just to turn up at the border with that, and for that cost to be activated. Now that individual would need to see a border force officer. They couldn't simply use an e-gate on entry, and there are certain parameters to activating a T5 cost at the border. So it's kind of a 3-month rule, really, whether it's a series of consecutive engagements or a single engagement of 3 months or less. Okay. Okay, next slide, please. Do the next slide.
That is your next slide. I was ahead of you.
Oh, you were. Thank you. Okay, so I mean, these are kind of the kind of practicalities of issuing a course under Tier 5. You know, can't be any earlier than 3 months after 3 months before the engagement begins. Now, in the creative sector, the rules retain this idea of kind of labour market testing. Now, traditionally, that's not particularly relevant in the creative sector. You know, you're not kind of putting an ad in Job Centre Plus and saying, you know, who wants to apply for my job. It's often a much more specific role that you're sponsoring someone for. So the codes of practice in the immigration rules, they give some substance to how you should be assessing an individual's suitability for sponsorship, and that's how the resident labour market is tested in a way. So it's things like you're looking to see whether a particular individual's required for example, for continuity, or whether they've got a particularly unique set of skills, you know, that you're sponsoring them to travel to the UK to demonstrate. Shortage occupation is relevant in TU5. There are a few shortage occupations in the arts and creative sector, generally quite high level work though. For example, kind of ballet, sort of classically trained ballet dancers and contemporary dancers may qualify, but only really if they're being sponsored by an internationally recognised company. Other shortage occupations, I was looking at it earlier, include it's certain musicians as well, but generally it's kind of in the classical context, you know, kind of internationally recognised orchestras. So shortage occupation perhaps not so much of an issue for most T5 sponsors, but labour market testing is not quite as hard as it sounds, I think. So it's worth bearing in mind if you're looking to get a sponsor license. Okay, next slide, please, Shara. So leaving aside or leaving behind specific sponsorship now, I'm just going to look at a few more routes. Some of them are still in T5. For which your organisation doesn't need its own licence. The T5 government authorised exchange is one example of this. So rather than each company or individual arts organisation having its licence and sponsoring somebody, an individual might enter under a government authorised exchange based on overarching sponsorship by another organisation. So, I mean, the obvious example in the arts is the British Council. That can act as a sponsor. Erasmus Plus and Erasmus Mundus are a couple of schemes which can, I mean, you're kind of shoehorning a little bit into those kind of educational programs. Somebody being sponsored by an overarching sponsor such as British Council, but it can work, you know, it can work in certain circumstances. So it's a maximum 12 months entry into the UK, and those are the other kind of additional requirements for government authorised exchange. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier what's formerly known as Tier 2. It's really hard for immigration lawyers to stop saying Tier 2 and Tier 5 now that they've rebranded everything. But so this the skilled worker sponsorship route, as I mentioned, for perhaps for somebody who's coming to work for your organisation on a permanent or a long-term basis, rather than individual artists who are just coming to to perform at certain events and that kind of thing. So rebranded from the 1st of this month, and cap on numbers has been removed. The general approach to skilled worker sponsorship is that there's a minimum skill level and a minimum salary level that your organisation would have to meet. And you've also got to demonstrate that you have a genuine vacancy that can't be filled by a resident worker. Now, what used to happen was a formal resident labour market test, but that's been abolished, and there's now much more kind of discretion for the individual organisation to assess the market and to say why they need to sponsor that worker from overseas. Okay. Next slide, please. Youth mobility, it's worth mentioning. I think the only European country which is currently covered by youth mobility is Monaco. But we anticipate that other EU countries may well be added to the youth mobility programme. There's a cap on numbers generally for this route, but it's for anybody aged between 18 and 30, gives them a straight 2-year visa, and they can basically do what they want, apart from there's a couple of restrictions there I've mentioned on self-employment, which may be relevant to artists and performers, I suppose. But you know, the kind of parameters for self-employment would seem to fit in, or you know, to allow a performer to work in that route. So that's perhaps something for the future. Okay, thanks, Shara. Next slide. I'm going to let Shara jump in here because this is her pet immigration route and she does it far better than me. So Shara, just a quick summary of global talent, please.
Yeah, so global talent is generally speaking the most exclusive visa route that we operate here in the UK. This is the route that the Home Office and the government are referring to when you hear them constantly talking about attracting the brightest and the best. So global talent is very restricted in terms of who can apply. It only applies in a couple of, or rather a handful rather, of particular qualifying sectors and fields. Arts and culture is one of those fields. And for applicants who want to apply into the Global Talent Scheme, they need to get endorsement from Arts Council that they are either established exceptional talent within their particular area of expertise, or that they show exceptional promise in their early career. Now, the reason that we've included global talent in the presentation today is because it is by far the immigration category that has the most sort of flexibility and freedom for the individual involved. They can work wherever they like, whenever they like, for whoever they like, at any time, as long as they are within their chosen field of expertise. But it does come at a cost, and that cost is that it's quite an involved and certainly very challenging application to make. So there are strict qualifying criteria based on whether you're an established talent or showing exceptional promise. And you also have to show that you've been nominated by other eminent people within your specific field. And quite often the applicant will need to show that they have been nominated or received fairly prestigious awards, quite often internationally recognised awards, in order to secure that endorsement. So it is absolutely not going to be the case that we're sort of saying to you, or if you're struggling to sort of, you know, get one of your people for your festival in under the visit visa section, global talent will absolutely be the option that they have. But there may well be individuals in future, perhaps those specifically looking for longer term options for the UK, that rather than having to get involved in all of the mechanisms of sponsorship that Gary's just been talking about, the individual themselves can actually qualify on their own. So if you are ever looking at slightly longer term relocation, or even relocation with a view to settlement, and the individual is either particularly well known or is very well established, global talent is an excellent option to at least consider. Because as I say, if the individual can qualify, then the degree of flexibility that they have compared to, say, somebody who is sponsored by an organisation is just, well, I mean, there is no comparison, to be frank. And it also means that for organisations, you do not have to engage with that sponsorship process. So always a good one to think about, but obviously restricted in application.
Thanks, Shara. Frontier workers is a new one for everybody, even Shara and me. And from the 10th of this month, so just a few days ago, this option has been introduced specifically for EU citizens, and it's very much worth bearing in mind if you've got somebody, and I appreciate there's been a pandemic and all that, but if somebody who's worked in the UK in the last 12 months or in the 12 months preceding the date that they make their application for a frontier worker visa, and they can demonstrate they've done genuine and effective work in the UK before the 31st of December this year, then they can get this this really nice 5-year visa, which allows them to come back over the next 5-year periods. And we understand it's going to be extendable as well, and it will allow them to work without restrictions, so without T5 sponsorship, without having to worry about PPE or permit-free festivals. It would just allow them to work in the UK because they've worked in the UK previously as EU citizens. Okay, so there might not be that many people, I suppose, bearing in mind what's happened in 2020 who have this as an option. But if you've got people on your radar who might potentially be eligible, then we would encourage them to apply. I think the deadline, Cheryl, correct me if I'm wrong, but the deadline for applying is the 30th of June 2021, isn't it?
Yeah.
For a frontier worker permit. It's actually a work permit. This is termed. Okay. Next slide. Okay, just a couple of other kind of more general points. I know this is something that cropped up in the questions we were given in advance. Any UK visa is multi-entry. You can come and go as many times as you want during its validity. Good character. Shara's already mentioned this, and I'm gonna just I've included a couple of slides. I perhaps dwelt on it a little bit too much, I suspect, because in the course of our work, we tend to see the problem cases more than the straightforward ones, and it's the people coming or wanting to come into the UK who perhaps got criminal convictions who do seek our advice more than others. Shara, next slide, please. Immigration rules contain these general grounds for refusal of applications. Now, there's a basic 12-month custodial sentence cutoff. Okay, mandatory refusal of permission to enter where you've got a conviction that led to a sentence of 12 months or more, or you're a persistent offender, or you committed a particularly serious offence. And then there's a discretionary raft of refusals, which are time limited, and there's a slide in a short while which sets that out more clearly than I can by describing it. Visitors, as this is kind of what Shara covered in the first part of the presentation. So not tier 5, remember, this is just for visitors. For visitors, and this includes, people looking at PPE or permit-free festivals, there's a mandatory refusal where they've had that conviction, received a custodial sentence of less than 12 months, unless it's been more than 12 months since the end of that sentence. Okay, and the other option there, that's a non-custodial sentence as a result of a criminal conviction, unless more than 12 months has passed since the date of that conviction. So this is always worth bearing in mind. Shara mentioned in relation to e-gates, yeah, you can, as an EU citizen, you'll be able to come in and use the e-gate, but the UK does use international databases which record criminal offences. Its ability to do so is kind of coming into question, I think, when we leave the EU, because I think it's no longer going to have access to some of those databases. But individuals who don't declare convictions and who try to use an e-gate do run an obvious risk. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and then there are also potential for refusal where there's been kind of immigration shenanigans in the past. So where false documents have been used in previous applications, relevant facts not disclosed. It's always worth, I think, getting legal advice if you've got an individual who has this kind of an adverse immigration history, as they probably call it. And the next slide, Shara, I think is just the that's just the table of kind of entry bans to the UK, and you can see some are pretty significant on that slide there. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, just to finish off, again, a short case study. So this company wishes to invite artists on a regular basis from all over the world for individual performances not linked to a particular permit-free festival. So engagements at a single venue, 6 to 8 week run, and the artist will be paid by the production company in the UK. So what sponsorship options is best for that individual? Okay, so first of all, we say, well, if there's anybody who's previously performed in the UK from the EU, they might well, be able to, to continue to benefit. They might have acquired pre-settled status, for example, and already have a right to come and work and perform in the UK without restriction. They might benefit also from certain other provisions, but I suppose most significantly, I don't know, my dog's just returning from her walk, so you're going to hear some barking shortly, I suspect. The Tier 5 creative route is the obvious route for sponsoring in this situation. One thing to bear in mind, if you're looking at applying for a T5 sponsor license, it's probably going to take you a few months to get one, so do plan ahead. Another point, I suppose, worth mentioning in relation to Tier 5 sponsorship is that because of the nature of the creative sector, there's not necessarily a requirement that the production company and the entertainer have a direct contractual. The individual doesn't have to be paid by the production company; could be paid by a third party, for example. The creative codes of practice recognise that there are all sorts of arrangements for finance and funding in the arts, and there's kind of due deference is given to the sector in relation to how T5 sponsorship works. Okay, and just a final point there. The point about visa-free entry at the border, because this is an engagement of less than 3 months. Okay, thank you. I think that's all we have. Thank you very much for listening, and let's get back into some questions, Kate.
Thanks so much, Gary. Wow, that was a lot, and particularly, I think I'll need to digest the Frontier one in particular myself, because that's not one I've encountered so much. I did actually get an email in my inbox, I think, from Philip, who isn't able to access the chat, just asking. I think it's not something you guys can necessarily answer, but it was just worth airing anyway. And I think it's something we'll pick up towards the end when we talk about the other mobility info points. But that frontier worker category, is that something that exists on the flip side in other European countries? And I guess you probably don't have an answer to that, but that's something we can also talk about later on in info points in other countries.
I'm not sure we do know for certain. I mean, the one thing I would say is that a lot of the things that have been organised in relation to EU nationals, even after Brexit, are quite often reciprocal. Well, I mean, everybody's seen what's going on with the Brexit negotiations. The UK hasn't necessarily been very forthcoming and sort of being particularly generous. Although having said that, we do have some provisions that have been made which are more generous than what was legally required. So it's quite possible that there will be things that are going the other way that are similar to that sort of scheme. But yeah, unfortunately, it's just not our area of expertise, I'm afraid.
Exactly. And I think that, so we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But unfortunately, while there are certain things that the EU can set across the board, particularly to do with Schengen, EU member states can then add their own rules on top of that. So it adds a kind of country-specific complexity to each of these questions, and you can see how complicated it is for incoming. So that's why probably one person's brain cannot hold all information for more than one country. But thanks for asking that, Philip, and we'll pick that up later. We had quite a few different questions coming up in the chat, and I might go to Rosie as well to help me pick up some of these. I guess there was a general question around why you would go for a cost certificate of sponsorship rather than PPE. I was picking up that there seemed to be, more flexibility in that you could have more than 1 month, so up to 3 months, I think it was. I'll let you obviously kind of clarify that. And it seemed that you could, I don't know if there's a restriction on PPE in terms of can you only come in once and then you're kind of, that's when you've entered in and you have to stay in, versus cost, you can come in multiple times. That was just a kind of question I had, and I guess obviously there's a cost there and the burden of administration there in terms of what you have to kind of prove. But so kind of that difference between costs and PPE and maybe the kind of thought processes you might want to take on, and obviously you have to be a sponsor to do the costs. So, but why would people consider being?
Yeah, I think it's the time. It's kind of the length of the length of engagements. The length of a tour, for example, is going to perhaps dictate really whether you're going to get T5 sponsorship. Because you need somebody here for longer. You've got a series of engagements, I mean the T5 generally it's kind of a 12-month maximum. That's what you get. The individual will get a 12-month visa to enter the UK. That's extendable for another 12 months up to a maximum of 24 months. So it's there's a lot more scope really. Somebody coming to, not perhaps base themselves here, but more so certainly than under a PPE. That will be possible.
And I guess also there seems to be more flexibility in who can pay you then afterwards versus the PPE. Would that be the case, in that perhaps you can undertake more activity that doesn't have to be directly managed by the sponsoring body if you've got costs? So I'm asking slightly.
I think, to be fair, I think kind of in a way the answer is sort of almost in the question. Permitted paid engagement is exactly what it sounds like. It is an engagement, whereas what you get with the certificate of sponsorship, because there is that sort of recognition of the fact that this is something that will be longer term, that when the actual sponsorship is given, there'll be like a kind of a job description, if you like, that's given by the sponsor to kind of confirm who they're sponsoring and what they're doing. And that might involve more than one thing. It might involve more than one event. It might involve events at different locations. So it just gives way more scope for somebody to stay for a longer period of time and to have much more diverse involvement and activity in the UK than permitted paid engagement would do. It's very deliberate that PPE is restricted to that month, because it's very much viewed as this sort of nice little self-contained thing, that somebody will only be here for 4 weeks just doing this one thing that is going to generate that almost that one payment to them. Whereas obviously certificates of sponsorship and ongoing sponsorship is that relationship. And as Gary says, it doesn't necessarily need to be that kind of formal company A is going to pay individual B, X amount every month, because that's not really how the arts works necessarily. But it's still a relationship between that organisation and that individual that's probably going to be far more enduring than a permitted paid engagement would be.
Yeah. And I'm aware that when we had a 4-nation visa summit up in Scotland in February, one of the suggestions that people were trying to advocate for was an extension of the length for PPE, because obviously a month doesn't necessarily cover the timescale of some tours, and particularly when we're looking at sustainable travel and so on. But obviously there's a big difference between how we'd like to see the system change, even if they're concrete and quite specific suggestions, and what actually exists at the moment, which is not necessarily tailored to how we work in the sector. Great. What was
Can I just come in, Kate? Sorry to interrupt.
Of course, that's great.
Just a point on how the Home Office views sponsor licensing generally. The whole idea in a kind of a post-Brexit world is that the process has been streamlined. They've been made easier for sponsoring organisations. So I would I would say to individual organisations that haven't got a license, you know, it's probably a good time. It's probably a good time to give it a go if you think you're going to need one over the next. I mean, they're valid for 4 years. Cost about 500 quid. So it's worth thinking about, I think, because it does give you so much more flexibility. And as I think Shara highlighted in her presentation, you know, there's quite a lot of grey area in the visit rules. You know, there's a lot of room for interpretation. There's a lot of nuance, I think, and you can be a bit more, I suppose, secure in your kind of knowledge that you're doing things right. You know, so you know, by getting a license and running that license, I think, you know, it's you know, probably a good time to be thinking about it. Yeah,
that's great. And that's one of the other questions I had was how long that license went for that £536 or something. So great. Rosie, did you have any other questions that you'd like to pick up while I gather my?
Sure. Yeah, there's only a couple of like outstanding questions really, and they're actually going back to the PPE visa situation around documentation. So someone's asked what kind of documentation would the organisation need to keep on file for those that they're bringing in, and also someone has asked how can an artist prove that he has a PPE visa if a venue or theatre requests it?
Okay, so in terms of from the organisation's point of view, first of all, about what documents do you keep? There aren't specific document keeping requirements that relate to people that are inviting others for PPE. That is hugely in contrast to the sponsorship system, for example, where document keeping is a real kind of focus in relation to how the Home Office views compliance. However, from a risk-averse point of view, we would always recommend that people keep specific documentation to confirm a copy of the letter that's been issued in relation to a PPE migrant to confirm exactly what that individual has been invited to do. If there's any kind of engagement documentation that's just between the organisation and the individual about the event or whatever it is that the individual is coming to participate in, certainly recommend keeping all of that as well. Also, from just a slightly kind of ancillary issue, but nonetheless important, from a right to work perspective, it would be important for the organisation to make sure that they have got confirmation of who that individual is. So a copy of their, I'll say passport. At the moment, national ID is also still acceptable, but that will be changing. So I'll say passport for now, because it's probably, from a longevity point of view, the safest thing to look at. And then also you would want to have, if the individual applied for a visa, so if they've got that stamp in their passport already, that actual kind of like sticker that's gone in, you'd want a copy of that. If they were stamped on arrival with the ink stamp, you'd want a copy of that page as well to confirm it. If they've come in through an e-gate, it's kind of difficult really, because the individual doesn't really have anything to show. I mean, Gary mentioned about things like flight tickets, etc. So that might be useful. But what the organisation wants to do is be in a position to be able to say, oh, Home Office, you're asking about that individual. Yeah, that's who they were. This is when they arrived. That's what they were coming to do. Here's the agreement that we had with them. So that's a suggestion. That's not essential, but that's what we would probably recommend to try and be safe. And then I'm so sorry, you're going to have to repeat the second part of that question. It's gone now.
So it was about what the artist needs to keep on file themselves, but they'll have everything in their visa and their passport stamps and everything, won't they?
They would, yeah. They'll obviously always need to make sure that they've got a copy of that letter. So I would say, I mean, obviously Gary explained that, you know, you turn up at the border, and as long as you've got that letter with you, that's when you can be sort of, you know, let in if you're not a visa national. But you know, even if you've applied for a visa beforehand, so even if it's somebody that's come from, say, for example, India, and they have that stamp, that sticker that's gone into their passport saying this person has a visa, we'd still recommend that they travel with their letter confirming what they've been invited to do and sort of what that sticker and visa has been granted on the basis of, because you do get inquisitive, is probably the polite word, border officials, and it may well be that the individual does still need to sort of justify why they've arrived at the UK border and why they're asking to be admitted entry. Having that sticker, that prior visa issued, that is not a guarantee that somebody will actually be admitted. It's effectively a form of kind of pre-clearance to get a lot of it out the way, but ultimately the decision is with the individual that's on the border. So the individual should always travel with that information, whether they've previously submitted to the Home Office or not.
Yeah, I've had experience dealing with visas for the US, and one thing we had to do a lot is make sure that people had evidence of return flights. Is that something that people need? Was that covered, perhaps?
It's not an essential component, so we always have to be a little bit sort of slightly reticent in sort of saying to people you must book your return flight home. But I mean, certainly we do see people refused entry, and then one of the reasons that they have been refused entry, the Home Office will always get a slight reference in if there is no return flight. So certainly, you know, if it's something like for example, if it's a PPE, then because it's going to be such a short period of time, one of the things that the border official might be sort of most interested in is, does this individual understand the restriction on their time period in the UK? Are they ready to go home within a month? So if you're then turning up at the border saying, I absolutely know that, here's my letter of introduction and my, you know, my kind of invitation to be in the UK, here's confirmation of my departure flight in, you know, in 3 weeks' time, that will always lend that extra sort of bit of credibility to that individual. So as I say, the immigration rules do not specify that somebody must travel with a return flight booked, but it certainly can help that individual to confirm that they understand what the restrictions are upon them. Great, thanks. Kate, do we have time for another question?
Yeah, let's try and squeeze another one in, and then we'll go to Dan and Taghrid. Sorry, and actually, Rosie, did you have one? That's what you were asking.
No, go for it.
I think we had just a few questions around denials in general. I know we touched on that before, but whether, you know, is there a process for appealing if you're at the border and for some reason refuse to come in under PPE? Are you able to appeal that? And similarly for, I think Dan was asking about costs as well. Is that right? Feel free to confirm that, Dan, in the chat.
Gary, I don't know whether you want to kind of jump in with that.
Yeah.
I mean, just going to say, generally speaking, the answer is no, unfortunately.
Yeah, you certainly don't get any rights of appeal at the border if you get if they're thinking of refusing you entry. This has all changed in the last couple of weeks. Actually, they've rewritten immigration rules, and there's a whole load of changes in relation to what they now call cancellation of permission to enter the UK. So as I say, no rights of appeal exist. When you're confronted with a difficult border force official, I think you're in a tricky situation really, because they've kind of got all the power, and they know, you know, there are no kind of rights of redress really beyond judicial review, which is, you know, a real kind of sledgehammer to crack a nut really. You know, it's going to be in a very rare case that you're going to be launching urgent High Court proceedings and applying for an injunction from a judge, you know, to get somebody accepted into the UK when the border force is thinking of turning them back. So this is it's kind of a downside really of being a non-visa national. Obviously, visa nationals they can get refused in their own country, obviously, but if they get the visa in advance, then they know pretty much they're not going to have problems at the border. Whereas somebody who's not a visa national could well have a problem at the border, and it is very difficult, you know, to deal with it if that happens.
Just on a practical point, just sort of going back slightly to that previous question in terms of what should an individual make sure that they've kind of kept document-wise, it's always recommended that the individual is travelling with access to the contact details for the organisation. So then in the event that there is a problem at the border, they can then either give them to the border official, so the border official can contact the organisation and ask any questions that they might have, or at the very least, the individual can contact them and let them know what's happening. So yeah, as I say, just a practical thing to make sure that people do travel with those details, because it can be a very, very stressful experience to be sort of detained at the border, even if it's just for questioning, you know, and then permission is then granted.
And it's also worth, I think it's a really good point, and we'll bring this up with Dan and Taghrid as well, as, you know, obviously we're asking artists and cultural professionals who do not specialise in migration to be arriving and to be navigating these in their non-native language most of the time too. So any way that in which the hosting organisation is able to support that. And I see Pamela Walker from Imaginate said that she quite often sends sponsor and invitation information to the Edinburgh Airport border office ahead of people arriving, and she's not sure if that has an impact or not, but they haven't had any issues. So I guess it's, you know, that that's potentially worth exploring. I did have, maybe we'll just do one final question, which I feel like this is more of a confirmation rather than anything else, but Georgia was asking, so if we're really like trying to be as sure as we can, is it best to get PPE applications to be done by artists before they travel and then go via staff desk at the airport rather than going through the e-gate? And I think I guess this is also just to check my understanding as well. It's not really so much of an application as having the invitation letter. Is that right for PPE? Unless you're also coming in under a visa too, would that be correct? So it would be having the invitation letter beforehand and then showing up at the border. But let me just check that understanding with you.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely it. I mean, in terms of the specific question, you know, is the absolute safest thing to do to apply for a visa? I mean, if you took that approach with absolutely everybody, the answer would be yes, if you could be confident that everybody would then be granted. But the problem with sort of applying for, say, EU nationals, you know, who don't necessarily need to apply for a visa, but then you apply for one anyway, is that rule of thumb is that you will see refusals that are probably completely wrong or are certainly questionable. And then you have very limited means of redress in relation to that. So I don't think that it's really... It's in the interests of either organisations or individuals to sort of say, you know, you should apply for documentation where there's no legal requirement for you to do that, because inevitably it will end up with somebody getting refused where they should not have been. But the best thing that you can do is just make sure that everything is, you know, is prepared as much as it can be, and that people are travelling with as much information as possible, and that they have all the right contact details to hand. And then, you know, it should be fine. There will be instances where people will be refused. It is unavoidable, unfortunately, because that's the nature of dealing with individual border officials who sometimes just have a really bad day. So it won't be the case that absolutely everybody who should be admitted is admitted, but you can at least make sure that you've got things that are in place so you can be as confident as possible that somebody will be admitted when they should.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point and very practical tip to have them arriving with an emergency contact. And I guess it just shows what the shift is going to be. You know, we used to have EU and EEA nationals, you know, just showing up on their plane and then going off and getting their dinner themselves and all the rest of it. Whereas I think there's probably going to be that extra care needed to, as with other people arriving from across the globe, of making sure that they've arrived safely and there haven't been any issues, and perhaps, you know, kind of making sure they feel they've got someone to check in and to liaise with there. So it is extra hosting duties and extra kind of administration duties there. So thank you both. I tell you what might be a good approach is perhaps we give you a breather and you can have a little look through the chat and see if there's anything you'd like to kind of pick up there or note for later on. What we'll do now is we'll go to Dan and Taghrid to kind of talk about Tier 5 and perhaps in relation to the other routes too, and share some of their experiences, because you know, I thought it was also really I was glad you brought up kind of this good charactering and history of criminality as well. It's like, it just demonstrates sometimes how much we might be diving into very personal details of people we're inviting, and perhaps also and Dan will have experiences particularly with English Pen, I imagine, of, you know, sometimes we're inviting people from quite oppressive countries where criminality means something quite different potentially too, but I won't necessarily open that kind of worms myself. But Dan and Taghrid, would you like to kind of take the floor a little bit and
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Kate, and thank you so much, Shara and Gary. It's been so informative. And for those of you watching the chat, yeah, apologies, as myself and Taghrid are trying to work out the new requirements around Tier 5 and bank balances and what employers can guarantee and that kind of thing. So it is very complex. Yeah, what I wanted to just say at the beginning before I hand over to Taghrid to talk about the kind of nuts and bolts of Tier 5 is just the applying to be a sponsor, which I led on for Shubbak. If you are going to do that, it's not as daunting as it may sound, but it does take some work, and I would strongly advise getting legal support from an immigration lawyer to go through the process with you. When we did it, we did get a spot check from the Home Office, which was also slightly terrifying, but was fine, and we got through it. So yeah, if you are doing it, I'd just advise getting some legal support. And it took us, I think it took us around about 4 months to get it turned around from beginning the process to becoming a registered sponsor. And then from then onwards, you have to essentially say how many certificates of sponsorship, or estimate how many you think you'll need in a year. And then every year you have to reapply for a certain amount. And if you haven't used, for example, I think we have had the experience of applying for 40, but then only using 10, and then applying for 40 again the next year, and them only giving us, say, 15. And then we've had to go back and say, well, that was an off year for the festival. This is an on year. And so hence we need the full 40. And then they get approved. But everything takes quite a long time dealing with the sponsorship license behind the scenes. If you want to change a name, for example, if an employee leaves the organization and you want to replace them on the as the named person to deal with the sponsorship, that can take up to 3 to 4 months to resolve. So factor in lots of time, and then lots of keeping of documents, which I may hand over to you, Taghrid, to talk about, if that's all right. Oh, you're on mute, maybe. Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thanks. So I thought I'd just offer a micro view and just a few tips that could be helpful to you as an organisation as you go through kind of a high volume of applications. In terms of time frame, I think in this climate, with the pandemic, it's really difficult to maximise on the 3 months prior to apply for visas. But if possible, do. And if not, don't worry, that there is a fast track option. It is expensive though, but I think almost always there will be instances when you need to use this, particularly in more complex immigration cases. And then I'd highly recommend that you just have your templates, both internal and external templates, ready from the beginning, and to trial them out internally a few times as well, and have separate processes. So one for the COS, the certificate of sponsorship, and the other for the actual application. Send them, of course, to the artists, but always kind of cross-check all the information yourself with the source documents, so passports and residency cards, particularly when, for example, names that are, non-English names could be spelt differently. You could get a refusal on that basis. So do check and always go with the name on the passport. Similarly, of course, with dates as well. And I'd highly recommend that you create checklists for artists for each step, particularly ahead of their in-person appointments. So think about maybe setting automated reminders. It can be really difficult to kind of rebook an appointment. And if they're missing any document, the letter, the COS, the residency card, when they arrive, then it really sets you back. And then I'd just advise that you think about making, of course, simplifying the process for yourself as an organization, but really working with and for the artist. And I guess what I mean by that is that if an artist is already very experienced with visas and is fine to fill out the application themselves directly on the portal, then that's great. You can share a login and a password, and they go ahead and do this. But I really highly recommend that they save the work but don't submit at all. That you go back in and have a second look at everything. Just always double check, and that you kind of press that submit button and not them. And because you can't edit once it's submitted, and you might have to, and it has happened before that we've had to pay for a new application. And I'd also just highlight kind of assumptions about accessibility. So both kind of language barriers. The interface is it offers some information in that that you can fill out not in English, but primarily and essentially it will have to be submitted in English, and it can also be very glitchy, and it is confusing, and I think that in terms of kind of thinking about a computer literacy as well, that you might want to consider, and this is something that I really do, is that I fill it out with the artist on the phone. what that also does in terms of kind of assumptions and thinking about issues of safeguarding is that there are very invasive questions, and there are questions where an individual could feel offended, unsafe, discriminated against, and actually not want to come to the UK. And this has happened to us before. So I think when there's a human voice on the other end, and you're giving a bit of a disclaimer and the background and setting the scene, it won't feel as daunting or as discriminatory for the artist. So there is that option too, you know, that actually you don't send them the template, the form to fill in, that you do it all verbally, but of course cross-checking all the source documents for spelling, dates, etc. And one thing I'd highlight in terms of payment, you have to state how much you're paying the artist, and often you might be inviting a company where you've got the agreement with the company manager and not per individual artist. Just bear in mind that the artist, you know, through the letter of invitation and their individual kind of certificate of sponsorship and application, will see what that payment is. So just make sure you've had that conversation with the company prior, and that you've worked out how much they're planning to pay the artist out of your kind of holistic fee, so there aren't any misunderstandings there. And finally, I think think about issues of GDPR and how, you know, you will be having access and copies of people's passports and residency cards and personal and family history. You know, there are questions around that in the application. So make sure that the artist is aware of how their personal information will be used, stored and shared within the organization. I think I'll leave it at that in terms of the practical tips.
Thank you so much, Taghrid. I've tried to summarize some of the things speedily that you were sharing there, and it's just really good to see that from the perspective of an organization. And I think there were some really important human touches, because I mean, it's very easy for us to talk about the system and information and which route to go, but at the end of the day, we're humans that are inviting humans over, and we need to make sure that it doesn't feel like we're, you know, just trying to process them, you know. And so those were really helpful tips. We are very short on time. I'm aware there's still some unresolved questions. I want to say thank you both, Dan and Taghrid, for chipping in the chat, and also for sharing that those tips as well with us. Thanks so much for joining. Oh, and I think, Dan, you had a quick final point actually before we move on to the outgoing mobility info point, but I think you were going to mention a Google group. Oh yeah, that's right. Well, yeah, thanks for that prompt, Kate. I was going to say one other thing, which is, yes, I completely 100% agree with everything Taghrid has said. The only other thing, as well as the human touch in terms of systems, is we made a folder. Keep a folder and keep everything in there for your own mental health, to keep everything just in one place, because it can be a bit overwhelming, a bit daunting in terms of the paperwork that you need. So as Taghrid mentioned, you know, have a checklist and then tick things off as they go into your folder, and then you know it's there in case you do get a spot check from the Home Office. And then Kate, just earlier you asked about people with criminal records. As mentioned, you know, we will occasionally be hosting artists coming from authoritarian states. And we have done that, and we have had people with criminal records. You just have to provide very strong documentation and speak to, a relevant group such as Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch to back up the claim that you're making in terms of why somebody would have, say, been held in prison in Syria, and how that's very different to having a criminal record in the UK. And then in terms of the Google group, yes, we do have an Artist Visas Google group. It is very informal and came out of the back of that letter that I shared on the chat earlier on. It's not hugely active, but occasionally it is, and I imagine it will be as people try and get to grips with the various new types of visa coming in. Yeah, a lot of the discussion on it tends to be around permitted paid engagement and Tier 5 visas. But if people would like to join that, Kate has very kindly offered to collate email addresses. So please just get in touch with her after this webinar, and she'll be able to then get you added to the list.
Okay,
great. And that's
it.
really
Thank
kind
you.
offer. Oh yeah, that's a really kind offer as well. And I've seen, you know, people sharing templates for invitation letters and just all those kinds of things that really help people at least get started and double check that they are taking the approach they feel they should be. So because it is, you know, you can very much feel like you're working on your own sometimes when you're going through documents and processes. So thanks so much both. So we are running a little bit over time as usual with these kind of events. Thank you for joining. And so for the final kind of 10-15 minutes, people don't mind staying a little bit longer, we are going to move to outgoing. And this event really isn't focusing on outgoing mobility, but we wanted to just, you can see how complex the issues are for incoming, and there are resources and information and support available for getting more information on outgoing routes, particularly now that that's going to change for EU and EEA countries. So without further ado, I want to say bienvenue and herzlich willkommen to Marie Voll and also Jan Runewald as well. So hello both, thank you for joining us. So Marie is going to talk a little bit about the Mobility Info Point network in general, and Jan is going to talk a little bit about how that works in Germany. And so hi both, are you there?
Yes, hi.
Hi Kate.
Hello, I'll just see if I can, oh there you are, so I'm going to pin you, and then Mary, if you'd like to go first, and I think you have a very short presentation to share.
Yeah, the only thing is I can't share it because of my setup. So if you could put
shall
it up,
I share it? Yes,
that would be great.
Do that. Great.
Thank you, Kate, for the introduction. I know we're over time, so I'm already going to run through this first information. Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me and for hosting this meeting on incoming mobility to the UK. I'm the president of the board of On The Move, which is a cultural mobility information network. And Kate, can you go to the next slide, please? Sorry for... Yes, so On The Move, you might know it for its website, very easily onthemove.org. It covers a lot of different topics which are linked to cultural mobility and cultural professionals of any discipline being mobile internationally, which is, of course, this year a bit different, but nonetheless very active. So we focus on any form of international cooperation, especially when funding is provided, where travel funding is provided, and we also developed a lot of guides to find funding for international activities. Can you bring up the next slide, please? So in a nutshell, On The Move is an official network with 48 member organizations plus 10 individuals. So we are 58 at the moment in many continents by now. And the focus is really to provide free, accurate, transparent, and user-friendly information for cultural professionals. And that applies to any of you as organization, but also any artists you work with and so on. Thank you, Kate. So within this network of cultural organization, within the members of On The Move, many felt the need to provide free, accurate, and reliable information on administrative matters. And this is based on the recommendation from the EU some 15 years ago. To provide information on visa, taxation, social security, customs, and so on. And we see now with Brexit how relevant and absolutely essential those this information provision is. So we provide this information through our members in English and in the local language in order to make mobility possible, especially so within the Schengen area. So far, it seemed very easy. But as Brexit is showing, it's actually much more complex, and anyone from outside of the EU has had to face this also with EU countries so far. But now for UK organization, UK professionals who want to collaborate and work with EU organization or tour in the EU and so on, you will have to deal with this information. So can you go to the next slide? Yes, so those are the current organizations that are working with this. And what is very important to stress is that as much as we have the impression that the EU is very unified and harmonized, with the Schengen area, for instance, the labor law and so on, they are very different per country. There is no one-fit-all situation. And actually, I will let Jana give the example of Germany later on, but basically there is also a lot of creative and cultural exception depending on the countries. Those are different, durations are different, social security is different. So it's really important to be able to refer you to specific organization in those countries who will help you know your rights so you can cross the border and know already in advance what it's all about. Kate, could you go to next slide? The Mobility Infopoint themselves work with other partners that are, for instance, I mean, I put two examples there who have set up online guides that are accessible for free. One is Zone Franche for the music industry in music sector in France, but also for Europe in general. The Ultimate Cookbook for Cultural Manager has been done by Pearl, Employer Association in the performing arts. So this is really, we work a lot with those organizations, and here is a snapshot of our last meeting online with all the Mobility Infopoints. So again, those are people who try their best. Well, not lawyers, but we all have followed a lot of law and trained themselves to be sure to know as much as possible about the cultural and creative regulation that apply to mobility toward their country. I think that was pretty much it. Yes, and so that's actually a good way to point to Jana for the rest. With COVID this year, you might have the impression that there was not much happening with the Mobility Infopoint, and actually, because of all the specific changes that were happening with entry being limited everywhere, what the Mobility Infopoint were busy with is to make sure that this information on who can enter, even with COVID regulation in place, who can enter a territory, under which rule, how do artists qualify to that? So the Mobility Infopoint have been busy working on this also this year, and especially Jana, very much so. So Jana, I'm letting you also take over on this part.
Thanks, Marie. Shall I just continue, Kate? Okay. Yeah, thanks, Marie, for the introduction, for giving a short presentation on the Mobility Infopoints. And I'm Jana Grünewald, as it was mentioned before, from Touring Artist. We are the German Mobility Infopoint, which means that we give information directed to artists that are based in Germany and who work internationally, so who go abroad for artistic exchanges and work. But also, and that is more interesting for you here, we also give advice for artists from abroad coming to Germany for artistic or cultural work or exchanges. And in that connection, we also give advice to organizers, so venues, galleries, etc., based in Germany who invite artists from abroad, so from the UK, for example. All the Mobility Infopoints are a little bit structured differently. It also depends on the resources that they have, like on the resources that the organization has or the person who's running the Infopoint. We have quite an extensive website with information on working internationally, and we basically cover all the topics that you might face, where you might face difficulties or obstacles when you work internationally. So it's not only on visa and working permits, residencies, but it's also on, taxes, withholding tax and reverse charge procedures. VAT is always a hot topic, one of the other hot topics. Apart from what Marie mentioned before, then social security issues, but also copyright issues or funding opportunities for international work. So we really cover quite a broad field of topics, anything where questions might arise when you work across borders. And in addition to the website, what is for us super important is that we have a consultation service where we offer individual consultations, because no matter how extensive a website is, no matter how comprehensive the information is that you give online, the individual cases are always more complex. And not only that, but I think it's also really important to have a person that you can actually talk to and that you can go through your case or your questions and difficulties with an actual person. It gives you trust that the information is right that we provide, etc. So this is really a great addition to the website that we have. Yeah, I mentioned before the resources, that every mobility info point has different resources, and we are quite lucky because in Germany, it was like when it was decided on EU level to facilitate international mobility for artists. In Germany, it was decided on a political level to set up a mobility info point, and we were actually approached by the ministry to set up a mobility info point. I say we, and this is the International Theatre Institute in Germany and the International Association for Fine Arts. So these two organizations actually set up the info point, and that was in 2012. So we are busy for quite a while already, and we are lucky because we get continuously funding since then, which is also necessary in order to keep up all the information and keep it updated specifically in order to be able to provide information that is correct. Yeah, because we're running out of time, I don't want to talk too much. Maybe what else is what I think is important? Maybe one thing which is also important for us, that I think Marie, you mentioned it already, all the service is free of charge. So everything like the consultations, the website obviously is free of charge, and we do address any artists or cultural professionals in any artistic field. So there's no restrictions in artistic fields or in where you are based. So no matter where you're based, you can use our services. And we are, as Marie also mentioned already, we are in a regular exchange with the other mobility info points, and this is also how we can provide information that is updated and extensive. And this is also where we're going to work now with Zelie from Wales Arts International to continue on working also on the Brexit section. We do have a Brexit section already on our website, and we will develop it now in the future, in the coming weeks. Unfortunately, that we have to do that, but at least we do have these information points that provide information and can somehow facilitate also international exchanges between, in this case, Germany and the UK. Maybe this as a little introduction, but if you have questions, I will also post our website and our contacts in the chat. Then feel free to contact us anytime you wish.
Thank you so much, Jana. It was really, really great to just give an insight into kind of how that works in one particular country. And thank you, Marie, for that overview. I think it just helps, hopefully, for people to see that there are existing resources out there, and resources that have experience, advising people in these kinds of mobility issues, whether it's ranging from, visas through to customs. I hope it also, on the other side, while we were looking to reassure, it's also just to kind of stress the level of complexity that does need to be navigated when you don't have freedom of movement and a particular type of trade agreement. So it is, there's a lot of information now needed to be navigated as we leave the end of transition period, and a high degree of complexity there, but there are information resources out there and in development as well here in the UK. So thank you so much for taking that time to join us, and I'd just like to say thank you very much to all our speakers today for bringing energy to what can be quite a difficult topic to trudge through, and I think we did manage to range across a lot of different issues. I know that there are questions. Thank you, Gary and Shara, for tackling questions in the chat as we've been covering mobility info points. There will be questions that we haven't had time to address, but we've kind of factored that in. Gary and Shara will be kind of having a look at those and I'll be working with them just to make sure we pick up those. If there's something burning that you feel might not have been noticed, feel free to email us, because that will help make sure that we definitely do address that specific question. You have my contact details from registering with the event. And so, yeah, I just want to say on behalf of Creative Europe Desk UK and Arts Infopoint UK as well, and thank you very much for joining us today and for staying so long in a 2.5-hour session on mobility related issues. And yeah, you all stuck on until the bitter end. So thanks very much for joining, and have a good rest of your day today.